Have you ever thought, what if your past made an entire town turn its back on you under the scorching noon sun in Silver Hollow Square? A woman stepped down from a horse-drawn carriage, her old blue dress faded, her eyes filled with hope. She was Clara Doyle, a mail-order bride, holding in her hands the love letter that once promised her a new beginning. But when she finally met the man who wrote those words, Nathan Brooks, she never imagined he would deny her and humiliate her before the crowd. All because she had once been a saloon girl. If it were you, what would you do? Bow your head in shame, or stand tall under the scornful eyes of the whole town? Clara chose the latter. She lifted her chin, read aloud the very letter he wrote, exposing his lies amid the murmurs and whispers. Then, as she turned to walk away, her heart shattered, but her gaze remained fierce, proud, and unbroken. In the dusty and judgmental West, sometimes a single act of courage can change your fate forever. Clara didn't know that. At the end of that red dirt road, another man, Elias Turner, a lonely yet kind-hearted rancher, had silently witnessed everything. And it would be he, not Nathan, who would give her a true future. Do you believe love can rise again from the ashes of humiliation? If you do, then join me on this story where a woman once rejected finds her dignity and true love again in the wild winds of the frontier. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to follow the heartfelt journey of Clara Doyle in Silver Hollow, where hearts are healed in silence. Noon in the town of Cedar Bluff always had a peculiar kind of light so harsh that everything seemed frozen in the heat. Golden dust danced along the red dirt road, reflecting off the gray wooden awnings of the jeweler's shop, the small cafe, and the peeling signboard of the town's post office. That day, under the blazing sun, a horse-drawn carriage came to a stop in the middle of the square. The coach was old, its wheels caked with dust, its sides chipped and faded like the weary journey of the one sitting inside. When the door opened, a woman stepped down, her face half hidden beneath a straw hat, her faded blue dress worn thin by time. Her name was Abigail Moore, a mail-order bride, and today she'd come to begin a new life. In her hands was a small cloth bag tied with an old string. Inside, just a few belongings and a bundle of carefully wrapped letters. The top letter was old, its paper yellowed, the neat handwriting still dark and legible. The author was Caleb Warren, the man she believed to be her destiny, a wealthy ranch owner living on the southern edge of Cedar Bluff. For 3 months, they had exchanged letters. In those words, Caleb had once written that he believed in honesty, that everyone deserved love no matter what their past held. Out here, he had written, everyone has something they'd rather forget. But if you keep a good heart, you deserve a new beginning. Those words had been the only light in the long dark nights of Abigail's life, a woman who once sang in the Golden Spur Saloon, where drunken men and deep-rooted prejudice clung to the air like dust on their boots. And now, she had come as promised. Her heart pounded when she saw Caleb standing outside the jeweler's shop, tall and neatly dressed in a crisp white shirt, his boots gleaming under the sun. He turned, and his cold gaze swept over her, nothing like the man from the letters. "Are you Caleb Warren?" she asked softly, her voice trembling but her eyes steady. "I am," he said, his tone dry as sand. "And you must be the woman who's been writing to me?" She gave a shy, gentle smile. "Yes, I'm Abigail. I came as we agreed." The train was delayed half a day, but she didn't finish before he cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade. There must be some mistake. Miss, if I'd known you once worked at the Golden Spur Saloon, I'd never have written those letters." The square fell utterly silent. Even the buzzing of flies seemed loud in the still air. Then whispers began to ripple soft at first, then spreading like wind through the prairie grass. A woman in a white lace bonnet covered her mouth to laugh. A few young men traded smirks and low whistles. Abigail stood there, gripping her bag tightly. The sunlight caught her eyes pale blue, steady as a lake before a storm. "I never hid anything from you," she said quietly. "I told you in the letters about my work, about the years I had to sing to survive. You were the one who said, 'The past doesn't define a person.'" Caleb narrowed his eyes, his face twisting in disdain. People will say anything when they want pity. A dry chuckle came from the crowd. "There she is, the saloon bride," someone jeered. Abigail took a long breath. For a moment, part of her wanted to run, but the other part, the one that had endured nights of howling wind and slurred songs, kept her rooted to the ground. Slowly, she opened her bag and pulled out the oldest letter, its edges soft and folded from being read too many times. "Do you remember this one?" she asked, her voice calm, not raised. "March the 3rd. You wrote," she read aloud, slow and clear, each word carving through the silence, "I want a wife to share loneliness, not to display. If you have a past, I will cherish it. It means you have lived. Honor doesn't lie in the past. It lies in how we live today." The crowd fell still. Some people lowered their eyes, others glanced at Caleb with a strange discomfort. His face flushed red, then pale. Abigail folded the letter again, her voice soft as a whisper. "You say, I don't understand honor, but at least I remember what you once wrote." Then she turned away and walked through the blistering light. The wind lifted the hem of her worn dress, making it flutter like a sad blue ribbon. No one stopped her. No one laughed any more. The click of her heels echoed steady the sound of a woman who had chosen not to bow. When she left the square, the sun still blazed, but the world felt changed. Abigail stopped by the red dirt road, where the wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant smoke. Her hand still clutched the letter, now wrinkled with sweat. "It's over," she told herself, but the voice inside her mind, carried by the wind, seemed to whisper back, "No, not yet." In the distance, dark clouds gathered over the ridge. Townsfolk hurried to find shelter. Only one man remained outside, sitting on his horse near the post office. He had been watching her the entire time, his gaze steady, quiet, and filled with sorrow. When she was about to walk away, "He spoke, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "You shouldn't be out here now. Storm's coming." Abigail turned to look at him. The man was in his 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with tousled brown hair beneath his hat. In his eyes, there was no pity, only an understanding silence she had never known before. "I don't know you," she said softly. "No need to," he replied, stepping closer. "Name's Ethan Cole. I've got a small ranch just south of town. If you've got nowhere to go, you can stay there, just for tonight, until the sky's clear." Abigail studied him for a long moment. After all the deceit she'd endured, this unexpected kindness left her uneasy. She no longer trusted easily, but she couldn't turn away from something that felt truly decent. "Just one night," she murmured, almost afraid to hear herself say it. Ethan gave a faint, reassuring smile and tipped his hat. "One night. They walked side by side, slowly passing the low wooden houses as the first drops of rain fell, mixing with the red dust and rising in that familiar scent of the West, the smell of solitude, of new beginnings, and of hope. That evening, rain poured over the old rooftops of Cedar Bluff, washing away the dust and the whispers. Inside the rattling carriage, Abigail sat beside Ethan, her heart both hollow and full, as if one chapter of her life had closed, and another was quietly beginning, carried by the sound of hooves fading down a rain-soaked road. That night, the rain kept falling on the porch roof of Ethan Cole's ranch. The steady patter of drops on the old boards mingled with the soft crackle of fire, the sound of a weary world slowly calming its heartbeat. Abigail sat by the window, gazing into the gray night where the plains were swallowed by mist. She stayed silent for a long while, her thin hands wrapped tightly around a cup of hot tea Ethan had just poured. No one spoke. Ethan sat a few steps away, eyes fixed on the fire, as if afraid a single word might break the fragile stillness that surrounded them. Then, very softly, Abigail's voice rose low, slow, as if telling something long buried, not to another person, but to herself. The day my mother died, she began. I was 15. We lived in Riverbend City, east of Montana, a small town by the river, filled with smoke and noise. My father had left when I was little, leaving just the two of us in a cramped room behind a laundry shop. Mother worked every day, but it was never enough for Samuel's medicine, my little brother. She spoke his name like a whisper, carrying the weight of a wound that had never healed. Samuel was born weak, she went on, a fragile boy, pale and thin as dry grass, but he smiled a lot. Even when he coughed up blood, he smiled, Mother used to say. His smile is what keeps us alive each day. Abigail paused, her gaze drifting toward the rain-blurred horizon outside, but she couldn't hold on forever. She died that winter. I buried her by the river in frozen ground, just me and Samuel. He stood there with a bunch of wildflowers in his hands, saying he'd sing her a song. She stopped, swallowing hard. Ethan said nothing, just nodded slightly, as if he could feel every fragment of her memory. After that, she continued. I had to survive. 16 years old. No father, no mother, only a sick little brother to care for. I got a job at the Blue Lantern Saloon, the one with the blue lamp that hung all night like a false star. People said it was where men drank and women lost their honor, but I had no other choice. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, echoing faintly like those long nights back in Riverbend City. At first, I just cleaned tables, washed glasses, but the owner said my voice wasn't half bad, and so I sang. Every night, I stood on that tiny stage beside an old piano, singing songs I never really understood. Men laughed, drank, tossed coins into my skirt, and I looked down, counting each one, thinking of Samuel waiting at home. Her voice grew hoarse thin as the wind itself. He kept getting weaker. I bought medicine, paid rent, cooked soup, did everything, but it was never enough. Every morning, I'd wake up and see he'd grown a little smaller, until one night, after singing, I came home and found him lying still, the same soft smile on his face, but his eyes closed forever. There was a long silence. Only the rain filled the space between them. Ethan lowered his head, his hands clasped tightly together. After the funeral, I quit my job for a while. Abigail said softly. I wandered along the river, not knowing what I was living for. I used to think, If someone had just held my hand then, told me there was another way, maybe I wouldn't have spent so many years learning how to trust again. She turned to look at him. In the flickering firelight, her face was both weary and pure, like a candle close to burning out, yet still shining bravely. "You know," she said gently, "people think saloon girls don't have hearts, but sometimes we're the ones who have to love the hardest, just to stay alive." Ethan looked up. "I believe that," he said quietly, sincerely. A faint smile curved her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the rain began to ease. The last few drops fell softly on the roof, disappearing into the earth. Warmth returned to the room. Abigail rose, setting her cooled teacup on the table. "After Samuel died," she said, "I couldn't stay in Riverbend any longer. Every corner of that place held a memory, the doorway where I rocked him to sleep, the little road to the river. Even the piano at the saloon reminded me of him. So I packed what I had left, sold my mother's necklace, and left the city." "Where did you go?" Ethan asked quietly. "I didn't know. I just wanted to get away from everything. Then, one night, in a worn-out boarding house, I found an old newspaper ad seeking a wife by correspondence. It was from a man named Caleb Warren in a town called Cedar Bluff." She smiled sadly. "I spent the whole night writing that first letter, the first one I'd ever written without feeling ashamed of who I was." Ethan didn't speak. He just looked at her, his eyes deep, carrying not pity, but respect. "Maybe," she said softly, "I didn't write that letter just to find a husband, but to see if I was still worth being heard." She stopped, then sighed. "And the rest, you already know." Silence filled the room once more. The fire popped gently, its light a warm gold. Outside, the rain had stopped. Mist settled over the young grass. Ethan stood, poured water into the kettle, then turned and said quietly, "You've come a long way. Abigail, maybe God brought you here not to start over, but to rest a while." Abigail smiled faintly. "I don't know if God still remembers my name," she said, "but I do know I'm tired." Ethan nodded, "Then stay tonight, sleep, tomorrow. The sky will be clearer." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. For the first time in years, there was trust in her eyes. As she walked toward the small room, he'd prepared her footsteps light as the wind. Ethan watched her go. A strange warmth rising in his chest, a quiet affection he couldn't yet name. That night, Abigail slept in the small guest room of the Turner Ranch, her first dreamless sleep in years. Outside, dawn crept gently over the dew-wet plains, and in that hush between night and day, she didn't know that a new chapter was quietly unfolding, one born from a fateful letter and from a heart waiting to be healed. Morning light slipped through the wooden shutters of Ethan Cole's ranch. The sky bloomed into soft shades of pink, tinted by dawn mist and the damp scent of earth after last night's rain. Dew still clung to the tin roof, glimmering like 1,000 tiny glass beads. Abigail awoke from a deep sleep, perhaps the first peaceful rest she'd had in years. She sat up and looked around the small room, rough timber walls, a little table, a jar of wildflowers by the window. The air carried the faint scent of hay and hearth smoke. Outside, roosters crowed in the distance, and the wind brushed through the tall pines, humming a calm, steady rhythm like a melody she used to dream of during long, lonely nights in Riverbend. In the soft morning light, memories returned as if each sunbeam carried a whisper from her past. She thought of Samuel, the small rented room filled with his coughing, of nights singing through the haze of smoke and laughter from drunken men, of the night she left that city behind stepping onto a train with a heart so hollow it barely beat. But she also remembered that same night the moment she found it. A crumpled newspaper left behind on a wooden seat, its edges worn, its print faded, and on the center page a small advertisement, no bigger than her palm. Wife wanted by correspondence. Man, age 32, barley rancher in Cedar Bluff, seeks a woman of honesty, courage, and a caring heart. Past unimportant, only a soul capable of love and respect for honor. Signed, Caleb Warren. Abigail read those words over and over. Every line felt as though it had been written for her. Past unimportant. Those two words struck her heart as if someone had gently touched an old wound with warm hands. She remembered it vividly, the train rocking through the dark plains, the dim lamplight flickering against the page, her weary eyes reflecting a flicker of hope. She stayed up all night, pen trembling in her hand, and began to write her very first letter to a man she had never met. Dear Mr. Caleb Warren, I don't know if I'm worthy to write to you, but when I read your advertisement, it felt as if someone had opened a small door in the darkness of my life. My name is Abigail Moore. I'm 27. I have no husband, no family. My mother has passed. I once sang at the Blue Lantern Saloon in Riverbend City. I know that does not earn me respect, but it was the only way to care for my younger brother who left this world last winter. I have nothing left to hide. If you seek a woman of honesty, I can only promise that I've never lied about my heart. I am not rich nor beautiful, but I know how to love, and I cherish honor because it's the only thing I have left. When she finished, she stared at the letter for a long time. It wasn't a plea, nor an excuse. It was a gentle confession, a door opening from a heart that had endured too much pain. The next day, she mailed the letter at a small-town stop along the rail line. Then she waited. In the weeks that followed, Abigail rented a tiny room on the outskirts of Rockridge and took a job at a sewing shop to pay for food. Every afternoon, she would visit the post office, waiting to hear her name called. 1 week, 2, on the 21st day, the old postman handed her a pale brown envelope. On it, clear handwriting read to Miss Abigail Moore, Riverbend Line. Room, note 3. Her hands trembled as she stepped behind the shop and sat on a weathered bench. She tore the envelope open. Dear Miss Abigail, I've read your letter 3 times, and truthfully, it's rare to meet someone who writes of herself without fear. Out here in the West, people talk about honor, yet they often forget that true honor begins with honesty. I don't care where you've been or what you've done. I care who you are now and what you seek in the days ahead. If you wish for a new beginning, come to Cedar Bluff. My ranch could use a caring hand, and my heart could use someone who understands loneliness. I promise nothing except respect. Caleb Warren. When Abigail finished reading, tears fell upon the paper, not from sorrow, but from a long-lost faith stirring back to life. That night, she wrote him again. The letters grew shorter, softer, like conversations between two wandering souls finding one another through ink and distance. They wrote for 3 months. Caleb told her of his barley fields, of the wooden house on the hill, and of the apple trees he'd planted for his late wife. Abigail wrote about her brother, about the old song she no longer dared to sing. Over time, their words became more than sentences. They became a thread, fragile but strong, tying 2 hearts across the empty miles of the frontier. Then, one evening, beneath a sky painted red by sunset, Abigail sat by her window holding his latest letter. Inside, Caleb had written, "If you're willing, come. Here, we can begin again. I'll be waiting in the town square on the first day of June." He ended with two simple words, "With honor." Those words made her heart tremble, not out of romance, but because they reminded her that kindness and integrity still existed in the world. That night, she packed her few belongings, an old blue dress, a handful of coins, and the bundle of Caleb's letters. She took one last look around the small rented room, a refuge for her loneliness, now a springboard for hope. Standing before the mirror, she studied her reflection under the oil lamp. Time had softened her youth, but could not dim the quiet light in her eyes. "Perhaps," she whispered, "this is the last time I'll dare to believe." When the train to the west departed, the final rays of Riverbend glimmered through the window, casting light across Abigail's face. She sat still, holding Caleb's last letter to her chest, a letter that carried all her faith, her fear, and her fragile hope. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly beneath the fading sky, and in the steady rhythm of the wheels on steel, a new journey truly began, the one that would lead her to Silver Hollow, where destiny awaited. That morning, the Montana sky was impossibly clear. Abigail Moore stood on the train platform. Her fingers clutching a small cloth bag inside were a few worn dresses, a frayed Bible, and a bundle of letters from Caleb Warren, the man she believed would be her new beginning. She had sold almost everything she owned, her mother's silver bracelet, the silk shoes she had once worn while singing at the Blue Lantern Saloon, even the wool blanket Samuel had used during his final winter. Each item gone was a piece of memory folded away, but she never looked back. There was nothing left in Riverbend to hold her any more. When the train whistle blew, Abigail stepped aboard, her heart pounding. Her journey west toward the town of Silver Hollow had begun. The train pulled away from Riverbend in a plume of gray smoke. Outside the window, the barley fields stretched endlessly into the horizon, broken by red patches of wild soil where cattle wandered through the morning mist. Each time the wheels screeched around a bend, the metal sang a steady rhythm, the heartbeat of the frontier itself. Abigail watched the passing land, her thoughts a tangled stream of hope and fear. She remembered the words in Caleb's final letter, "If you come, I'll meet you in Silver Hollow Square." The wind always blows from the south there, and the afternoon sun is so beautiful it hurts to look at. She had read that line 100 times along the way. At every stop, she would take out the envelope, open it, and read again to remind herself that there were still good men in this world, and that someone out there was waiting for her. She pictured him a kind man with steady eyes, a calm voice, tall and gentle against the prairie wind. Maybe he would smile when he saw her step off the train. Maybe he would take her hand carefully as though holding something fragile and precious. That image gave her courage. It carried her through 2 days of endless travel, through nights of restless sleep on wooden benches, lulled only by the steady sway of the train and the whistle that cried into the wind. By the third afternoon, when the sun dipped low behind the far mountains, the train finally rolled into Silver Hollow, a small town nestled quietly in the wide grasslands. Wooden houses lined the dusty main road, their faded signs half covered by drifting red dust. Beyond them rose the church bell tower, weathered but proud beneath the burning sky. Abigail stepped down from the platform, her boots sinking slightly into fine dust. She drew a deep breath. The air smelled of dry soil, faint smoke, and wild pine carried on the southern wind. It was the scent of the frontier, rough, raw, and alive. She brushed off her sleeves, adjusted her blue dress, and began walking toward the square, the place where, according to the letter, Caleb would be waiting. But the square was quiet. A few women lingered near the bakery, baskets in hand. Children played by the well, tossing pebbles and laughing. Near the saloon porch, a group of men leaned back in their chairs, watching her with curiosity. Abigail stopped, her heart beginning to race. She glanced around and then saw him. Caleb Warren. He stood near the jeweler's shop, tall, neatly dressed in a crisp white shirt, his boots polished, his hair combed back just so. He wasn't quite as she had imagined him, colder, perhaps more distant, but still. This was the man whose words had carried her across miles of loneliness. Abigail smiled, a trembling kind of hope lighting her face. "Mr. Caleb," she called softly as she approached. He turned, his gaze uncertain. "You are Abigail Moore," she said, her voice gentle, almost trembling. "I came just as you asked." For a moment, silence. The people nearby began to glance over. Then, slowly, the faint smile that had touched his lips disappeared. "You're the one who wrote to me?" he asked, his tone shifting, hardening. "Yes," she said. "I know I arrived earlier than planned," but he cut her off. His voice was cold as iron. "Then, perhaps you should turn around. I have no wish to be involved with a woman who once worked in a saloon." The words fell like a blade. A murmur rippled through the square. Someone laughed a sharp, mocking sound. A woman near the well whispered, "See, I told you she's that singer from the Blue Lantern." Abigail's face turned pale, but she stood tall. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. "In your letters, you told me that a person's past doesn't define who they are." Caleb's jaw tightened. His voice grew cruel. "I said that to a woman of virtue, not to your kind." A burst of laughter rose from the crowd. For a moment, Abigail could hardly breathe. Shame burned through her chest. But then, slowly, she opened her bag, pulled out a worn, creased letter, the one that had once made her believe in love and honor. "You wrote this," she said, her voice steady, rising just enough for all to hear. "You said, 'I will honor those who live truthfully.'" Do you remember that she unfolded the page and began to read aloud each word, cutting through the murmurs like wind through tall grass? "I believe honor is not where we've stood, but how we treat others." Silence fell. The laughter died. A few townsfolk lowered their heads. Others looked at Caleb with unease. His face flushed red, then drained of color. Abigail folded the letter carefully and said softly, "True honor doesn't need to be spoken. It's kept in the promises we make." Then she turned and walked away. Her blue dress caught the wind, fluttering behind her like a faded banner. No one stopped her. No one laughed. The only sound was her steady footsteps fading against the dirt road, the rhythm of a woman who refused to bow her head. As she left the square, the wind swept through again, scattering the dust and the whispers, carrying them off into the open plains. Later that afternoon, Abigail stopped outside the post office. She looked up at the weathered sign, Silver Hollow Post, the paint flaking, the letters barely hanging on. The mountain breeze brushed against her face, bringing with it the faint scent of barley fields from far away. Her heart felt hollow, but somewhere inside that emptiness burned a quiet ember pride, small yet unyielding, refusing to be extinguished. She sat down on the wooden steps, her hands trembling as she unfolded the letter once more. She read it slowly, one final time, every word slicing deeper, but she didn't look away. When she finished, she folded it neatly and tucked it into her pocket. "It's all right, Samuel," she whispered, maybe to her brother, maybe to herself. "I've learned how to stand." The sun was setting now, laying a red-gold glow across the rooftops and glass windows of Silver Hollow. As that light fell over her face, Abigail rose, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and walked down the empty street, small, solitary, but unbroken. That evening, after the crowd had scattered and the square had grown still, a man stepped out from the shadows beside the post office. It was Ethan Cole, who had watched everything from afar. He stood for a long while, gazing at the road where Abigail had disappeared into the dusk. And, though he could not explain why, a quiet sorrow and something deeper stirred within him. Perhaps, at that moment, fate had begun to turn, silent and patient, like spring whispering its way into the heart of winter. The evening wind swept through the wooden eaves of Silver Hollow, carrying the scent of coal smoke and red dust. After the crowd dispersed, the square fell silent again, only the faint creak of the saloon door and the distant rhythm of hooves echoing down the main road. Abigail Moore still sat on the post office steps, her hands resting on her small cloth bag, her eyes empty, staring into the fading light. The letter from Caleb lay crumpled in her palm, the paper worn and smudged with dust. No one looked back at her. The town had found its new story to whisper about for weeks to come. The mail-order bride who got rejected, the saloon girl who thought she could change her life. Each phrase fell like a stone into her chest, cold, heavy, and cruel. She stayed there until the last streak of sunlight slipped below the rooftops. The dying glow touched her face, lighting eyes too tired to cry anymore. Then, from across the street, a calm male voice broke the stillness. "Are you all right?" Ma'am Abigail lifted her head. A man stood before her in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, his face sunburnt and lined by wind. A faint stubble framed his jaw, and a weathered cowboy hat shaded his eyes. He still held an envelope, its edges stamped and sealed. He must have just mailed a letter. But it wasn't his looks that caught her attention. It was his eyes, quiet, steady, free of judgment. "I'm fine," she murmured, her voice rough, just tired. He nodded slightly. "I can tell." Then, after a pause, he said, "Name's Elias Turner. I run a small ranch south of town about 7 miles out." She didn't answer. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the moon was rising pale above the rolling hills. "I don't mean to pry," he said gently, "but I saw what happened earlier. And I couldn't just let a woman sit alone on the street like this." The words startled her. She'd heard too many voices in her life, pity, lies, propositions, but this wasn't any of those. His voice was plain as oak, rough-edged but warm. "You don't have to worry about me," she said, trying to sound composed. "I'll leave town in the morning. And tonight," Elias asked, "the post office isn't much shelter. Nights here get cold, you'll catch a chill." She said nothing. Elias laid the letter he'd been holding on the step beside her, then said quietly, "You can come with me to Turner Homestead, just for a few days, until you decide where you'll go next." Abigail studied him with suspicion. "Why would you want to help me? You don't even know me." He offered a faint, tired smile. "Because I know what it feels like to stand alone while everyone else looks away." The answer silenced her. In the pale moonlight, his face looked lonely, not the kind of loneliness that hides behind pride, but the kind that has learned to live with sorrow. They said nothing else for the rest of the walk out of town. The road was rough, the wheels of his wagon stirring clouds of red dust behind them. The moon climbed higher, casting silver light over the dry fields that stretched endlessly into the dark. Elias sat in front, holding the reins steady. From time to time, he glanced back to see her silent, her hands clutching the edge of her skirt, the wind tugging loose strands of hair across her face. "Would you like me to talk?" he asked softly. "No," she said. "I like the quiet." "Then I'll stay quiet too," he replied, and he did. For the rest of the journey, there was only the sound of gravel under the wheels and the whisper of crickets in the grass. Abigail felt her heart begin to ease, as if, for the first time in months, she'd found a space untouched by judgment. When the wagon stopped before the wooden gates of Turner Homestead, it was already late. The small house stood nestled among rows of willow trees, a thin trail of chimney smoke drifting into the cool air. Beyond it lay a horse stable and wide fields, glimmering faintly under the moonlight. Everything was simple, but it breathed warmth, life, and peace. Elias stepped down first, holding the lantern high. "It's not much," he said, "but there's room enough for two." She followed him inside. The scent of pine wood and burnt coal filled the room, wrapping her like a blanket. He knelt by the hearth, coaxing the fire back to life until the glow spread across the rough wooden walls. "You can rest in that room," he said, nodding toward a small door down the hall. "The bedding's clean, washed this morning." He handed her a wool coat. "It gets cold after dark." Abigail hesitated before taking it. "I don't want to be a burden." Elias looked at her steadily. "You're not. Sometimes a person just needs a place to sit still and breathe." She sat near the fire, wrapping her hands around the cup of tea he'd poured. The warmth spread slowly through her fingers, up her arms, into her chest. Outside, the wind rustled through the fields, but inside, time seemed to slow. "You live here alone?" she asked after a while. He nodded. "For 3 years now. No wife, no children." A shadow crossed his face. "Once, but they're gone. Fever took them that winter." His voice didn't break, but something in it carried the weight of loss too deep for words. "All I have left is this house and the land around it." Abigail lowered her eyes. She didn't speak again. The two sat in silence, listening to the soft crackle of fire. Two souls, one who'd lost faith and one who'd lost family, sharing the same quiet without needing to fill it. Before leaving the room, Elias said softly, "If you want to go, I'll take you back to the station whenever you're ready. But if you need time, this place has enough peace to mend a heart." She watched him disappear through the doorway. Outside, the night wind drifted across the meadow, carrying the scent of honeygrass and smoke. Abigail closed her eyes and breathed deeply for the first time in days, without pain. The next morning, Abigail awoke to the sound of roosters and the scent of fresh bread. Sunlight streamed through the small window, painting golden lines across the walls. For the first time in years, she didn't fear the day ahead. Somewhere deep inside, something had begun to stir, not love yet, but the fragile feeling of safety, And that, perhaps, was where every good thing begins. The first morning at Turner Homestead broke in a wash of pale gold. Through the small window, Abigail Moore saw the meadows stretching wide beneath the dawn. Sunlight glimmered across the dewdrops, turning each blade of grass into a thread of silver. Far beyond, cattle waded lazily through a shallow stream, and the wind carried the scent of wet soil and new grass, that gentle, wholesome fragrance she hadn't known in so long. When she sat up, her bare feet touched the cool wooden floor, and she realized someone had laid an extra blanket over her during the night. It must have been Elias, a simple gesture, but it warmed her chest like a hand softly placed over a long-healed wound. Outside, the rhythmic sound of hammering echoed faintly. She drew the curtain aside. Elias was up on the roof, replacing warped boards, his broad shoulders outlined against the pale sky. He worked in silence, steady and precise, every swing of the hammer a heartbeat of the house itself. In the kitchen, a fire already burned low in the stove. On the table sat a loaf of bread, still warm, and a small folded note in slanted handwriting. "I'm out at the barn. If you'd like, the kitchen's yours. E. to..." Abigail read it several times. Brief, plain, not a word wasted, and yet something in it made her smile. She mixed flour and water, rekindled the fire, and baked another loaf. The smell filled the cabin, mingling with the scent of grass outside. For the first time in years, the air around her felt like home. When Elias returned, he stopped at the doorway, surprised to see her wiping the table, hair loose around her face, hands busy with a rag. "You don't have to do that," he said, slightly awkward. "You're a guest here." "No," she replied quietly. "I'm not good with words. Doing something to help. It's easier." He nodded, a faint smile crossing his face, the kind that came rarely but felt real when it did. "Then think of this as home, at least until you find where you're headed next." Abigail looked down at her flour-stained hands. "I don't know where that is anymore," she murmured, "but I won't stay long." He didn't press further. Out here, silence was its own form of respect. The days slipped by gently, like a slow-moving creek winding through the grasslands. Each morning, Elias rose early to mend fences or led the horses out, while Abigail swept, cooked, and washed. They spoke little, a few words, a nod, a shared glance. But in those small exchanges lived something steady and wordless peace. At noon, he'd return with an armful of firewood. Setting it by the porch, she'd hand him a cup of cool well water. No one thanked the other aloud. The gratitude was in the rhythm of their actions, simple, familiar, human. One afternoon, while she hung clothes to dry, Elias approached, carrying an old wooden chair. "Was thinking of throwing this out," he said, "but it just needs a new leg." Abigail smiled softly. In Riverbend, people would have tossed it without a thought. Out here, everything gets a second chance, doesn't it? Elias looked at her, the sunlight catching in his pale blue eyes. "Out here, if you don't learn to mend what's broken, you won't have much left to live with." She went quiet. She didn't know if he meant the chair or the two of them. At supper that evening, the firelight danced across his face, calm, thoughtful, carrying an undercurrent of sadness. Abigail spoke of Samuel, of lullabies she used to hum to him when he couldn't sleep. Elias didn't interrupt. He only listened, the way men of the frontier listened not to reply, but to understand. Afterward, he stoked the fire, adding a thick log, "Nights get cold," he said. "Best get some rest." She nodded. "You've been kind to me, Elias. I'm not used to that." He looked at her quietly. "No need to get used to it," he said softly. "Just believe it's real." Days turned into weeks, and a quiet harmony settled between them. Elias never asked about her past. Abigail never asked about his. They simply shared the slow rhythm of prairie life meals, chores, the silence of dusk. One stormy afternoon, rain pounded the roof in heavy sheets. The old shingles began to leak. Elias climbed up to repair them, water streaming off his hat brim. Abigail stayed below, passing up planks through the rain. "You should go inside," he shouted over the wind. "You'll get soaked." "Not while you're still out here," she called back. When the storm finally broke, they stood together beneath the porch, drenched to the bone. Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't know," he said quietly. "Sometimes just having someone stand beside you in the rain is enough to keep a man going." Abigail looked down, her lips trembling into a shy smile. "I think I understand." Time flowed softly after that, not in grand events, but in the gentle weave-in of shared moments. A cup of tea left on the table when one was tired, a mended collar sewn without being asked. The soft sound of his footsteps each night as he checked the windows, the fire, the lock's small proofs that someone cared whether she slept safely. Abigail came to understand that peace wasn't about forgetting the past. It was finding a place where the past no longer frightened her. One morning, the sun rose warm and bright. Elias was out splitting logs, the swing of his axe steady and sure. Abigail brought him a cup of water. The sweat along his neck glistened in the light. For a fleeting moment, her heart trembled a fragile stirring. She didn't dare name. Then she stepped back. She wasn't ready yet. Trust, like the roof they'd rebuilt, had to be mended piece by piece with patience and care. That evening, as she set the table, Elias spoke quietly. "I don't know how long you plan to stay, Abigail, but if you'd like, there's always an empty chair here." She looked up, meeting his gaze steady, unforced, sincere. "Maybe I'll stay," she said softly, "at least until I remember how to smile again." He nodded, a rare warmth in his expression. "Then I hope that day comes soon." But where there is light, shadows are never far behind. In Silver Hollow, whispers had begun to stir. They spoke of the saloon singer now living with the widowed rancher, of shame hidden behind the walls of Turner Homestead. The rumors spread faster than wind across the plains, and before long, the fragile piece of that small wooden house would tremble beneath the weight of judgment once more. Days at Turner Homestead passed in peace until the wind began to shift. Spring faded quietly from the fields, giving way to the sharp heat of early summer. The grass turned brittle underfoot, and even the air in Silver Hollow grew dry and tense, as though holding its breath before a coming storm. Abigail Moore still kept her daily rhythm washing clothes by the well, tending the small garden behind the house, baking bread that filled the rooms with warmth. The work steadied her, made her feel useful again, human again. Her hands, once trembling from fear and memory, had found their strength. But beyond the fences, something else had begun to spread softly, persistently, and cruel as cactus thorns. It began with Martha Green, the grocer's wife. One morning, when Elias came into town to buy seed, She leaned over the counter, her smile tight as twine. "Heard you've got company out there now." "Elias, that woman from the Blue Lantern, isn't it?" Elias looked up. His eyes hardened, though his tone stayed calm. "Her name is Abigail Moore. She's helping me keep the place running." Martha gave a little shrug. "Sure, everyone's got a name." She turned to the other women in the shop, and that sly, knowing smile lingered. It didn't take much more than that. By evening, the story had caught fire. At the saloon, where whiskey turned rumor into entertainment, voices whispered and laughed. Elias Turner's got himself a woman out on that ranch, that singer from the Lantern. I'll bet. Didn't think he was the type. The next time Abigail went into town to buy flour, she felt the change in the air. The shopkeeper avoided her eyes. Children huddled near the doorway, snickering as she passed. One boy, the blacksmith's son, spat toward her hem and shouted, "Go back where you belong." Saloon girl. Abigail froze. Her face went pale, but she didn't move to defend herself. She simply bent down, wiped the stain from her skirt, and walked on each step slow, proud, deliberate. Behind her, laughter followed like the crack of a whip. Then a low voice broke through it all. "That's enough." Elias Turner was there. He walked forward slowly, but there was fire in his eyes, a quiet, controlled fire that could burn if pushed. He placed himself between Abigail and the growing crowd. "Who taught you to treat a woman that way?" he said. His voice rough with anger. A man from the saloon smirked. "You defending her. Elias. Everyone knows what she is. Thought you were better than that." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'm not better than anyone," he said evenly. "But at least I don't use my mouth as a weapon to shame the defenseless." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. From the edge of the street, Martha Green spoke up. Her tone syrup-sweet, but her eyes sharp. "Such a pity. Elias, you used to be a man this town respected." He turned toward her, his voice steady as steel. "Respect doesn't come from gossip. It comes from how you treat those who have less power than you." Silence fell. Abigail stood motionless, her head bowed, her hands clenched tight at her sides. Elias stepped closer, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. Then, in a voice that carried through the square, he said, "This woman has more dignity than every one of you using lies to wound her. If you lack the courage to live decently, then at least have the decency to hold your tongues." No one spoke. The wind blew through the street, stirring dust and dry grass. A few men looked away. Others dropped their gaze entirely. Abigail felt his hand fall from her shoulder, but the echo of his words stayed with her, burning and beautiful. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Now they'll turn on you, too." Elias gave a faint, crooked smile. "If standing by you makes me unclean in their eyes, then I can live with that." She turned away, blinking back tears. They rode home in silence, the wagon wheels crunching over dry gravel. The sun hung low, bleeding red across the plains. After a long while, Elias spoke quietly. "Don't let their words make you smaller. Abigail, I've lived long enough to know out here. Honor isn't about who people think you are. It's about what you stand for when they're all against you." She said nothing, but something inside her shifted a thin layer of frost that had wrapped itself around her heart for years. Now, beginning to melt, she realized then that some people don't have to say, "I believe in you." They prove it just by standing beside you. That night, rain began to fall as they reached the homestead. The drops clattered against the tin roof, washing away the day's dust and cruelty. Elias built a fire. The glow flickered across his face, calm now, but deep with thought. Abigail sat quietly, listening to the crackle. "Aren't you afraid?" And she asked finally. "They'll boycott you, cut you off. You could lose everything." He smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the fire. "I've lost plenty already. Reputation isn't the worst thing a man can lose." "Then, what has she asked?" Her voice barely above a whisper. "Becoming someone who's too afraid to defend what's right." Abigail's throat tightened. "No one's ever told me I had dignity before," she said softly. Elias turned toward her, his gaze kind. "Then start believing it now. You have worth, Abigail, not because you've been flawless, but because you've kept your heart kind in a world that isn't." Outside, the rain began to fade. She stepped out onto the porch, watching it fall in the last silver streaks. The scent of wet earth filled the air. Somewhere in the barn, the horses stirred softly, and in her chest, something fragile and real began to bloom, a quiet faith she hadn't felt in years. After that night, a strange chill came with the summer winds. Inside the wooden house on the prairie, two solitary souls grew used to each other's presence, and silence began to feel like comfort. Between them, something was taking root light as the wind across the grasslands, but deep as the prairie roots below, and it was, though neither dared to name it yet, the beginning of love. Winter came early that year in Silver Hollow. Winds swept down from the snow peaks, sharp as blades, cutting through the dried grasslands and howling across the valley. Snow blanketed the wooden roof of Turner Homestead, muffling the world in a thick hush of white. Inside that small cabin, only two sounds filled the air: the crackle of the fire and the breathing of two people who shared a roof, yet carried separate silences in their hearts. Since the day Elias Turner had stood before the whole town to defend her, no one had dared humiliate Abigail Moore to her face again. But the stares remained cold, judging every time Elias came into town for supplies. He didn't care. And Abigail learned to lift her chin higher and meet the world without flinching. Each night, she sat by the window, watching the snow fall, listening to the wind claw at the shutters. She wondered if trust could grow in her heart, the way seeds slept beneath the frozen ground waiting, patient for spring. One night, when the storm outside howled hard enough to shake the lanterns, Elias stepped through the door, coat dusted white, hands raw from the cold. He dropped a bundle of firewood by the hearth and exhaled a cloud of frost. Abigail looked up from the pot simmering on the stove, where the scent of onions and celery filled the room. "You must be freezing," she said softly. Elias smiled faintly, brushing snow from his hat. "Just a bit numb. Winter out here doesn't take pity on anyone." She ladled out a bowl of soup, sliding it toward him. The steam curled between them, warm and fragrant. He ate quietly, the way he always did. Then, without looking up, he said, "My wife used to make this same soup, but I think yours has more heart in it." Abigail froze for a moment. He rarely spoke of the past. "Would you tell me about her?" she asked gently. He was silent a long time, eyes fixed on the fire. "Her name was Martha," he said at last. "Kind woman, always laughing. She and our boy. They died one winter like this. Storm came too early. I went out for firewood, came back too late. The fire crackled softly, the only sound between them. Abigail looked at him, this man who wore his sorrow like a second skin, and saw something fragile beneath all that strength. "You've lived alone since then?" "Yes," he said simply. "After that, I forgot how to talk to people, until you came." She lowered her gaze, her hand resting near his on the table, not touching, but close enough for warmth to pass through the air between them. They sat there for a long time, two quiet souls listening to the whisper of snow outside. And somehow, in that shared silence, their loneliness reached across and found each other. The snow thickened over the days, piling knee-deep around the barn. Abigail helped Elias haul water, chop wood, mend his torn coat. Each task, though small, felt like stitching herself into the rhythm of this place like she belonged here. One evening, Elias came in from the cold carrying a glass jar. Inside glowed golden honey, the color of trapped sunlight. He set it on the table and said, "Harvested it from the hives before the frost. Honey's precious out here, but I figured you should have some. Helps you sleep." Abigail touched the jar. The warmth from his hands still lingered on the glass. "You're too kind," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." He smiled faintly. Just don't leave too soon." She looked up into those calm, lake-deep eyes, and the air between them shifted, subtle but irreversible. Neither spoke again, but something inside them both began to move quiet as breath. Impossible to turn back. That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. She spooned a drop of honey, its sweetness melting on her tongue, and sat by the window. Outside, snow fell in waves of silver, each flake shining like a tiny star under the moonlight. A smile touched her lips, small, real, and rare. Then she began to sing. A song from Riverbend City, the same lullaby she once sang for her little brother before sleep. At first, her voice wavered, soft and uncertain, but soon it steadied, filling the small cabin with a low, tender melody fragile as frost, but full of life. In the next room, Elias listened. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. He simply lay there, eyes closed, letting her voice drift through the walls, a voice heavy with sorrow, but carrying hope all the same. And for the first time in years, Elias Turner felt peace. The next morning, Abigail found the honey jar replaced with a fresh one. Tied around the lid was a slip of paper, scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting, "For your voice. It makes this winter a little less cold." Her fingers trembled as she held the note. The warmth that bloomed in her chest had nothing to do with the fire. No grand confessions, no promises, just a jar of honey and a few honest words. And she knew something was blooming between them, fragile yet fierce, like a wildflower daring to rise through snow. The days continued quietly. He split wood, she swept floors. They led the horses out together when the rare sun broke through the clouds. No one spoke of love, yet it was there in every shared glance, every gentle pause. One afternoon, as they crossed a frozen creek, Elias reached out a hand to steady her. His fingers lingered around hers a heartbeat longer than necessary. She didn't pull away, and he didn't let go right away either. They both laughed softly, then shy, embarrassed, and turned aside. But inside them, something vast and wordless had shifted. Yet happiness, on the western frontier, never lingers long without being tested. When the snows begin to melt and the rivers swell again, The past buried but never gone starts to rise with the thaw, and with it comes a stranger to Silver Hollow, carrying accusations that will force Abigail Moore to face the darkest parts of her own story once more. Snow had fallen for 3 days and 3 nights. It lay thick upon the wooden roof of Turner Homestead, gleaming silver under the pale moonlight, wrapping the prairie in a hush so deep that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb it. Inside, the fire burned low, casting golden light across the cabin walls, softening the loneliness that had long lingered between the two souls who shared this shelter. Abigail Moore sat by the window, a worn Bible resting on her lap, a gift Elias had placed there back in the fall. She wasn't reading it. She only stared out into the white, where the snow drifted endlessly, light as breath, falling over a sleeping world. The door opened with a sigh of cold wind. Elias Turner stepped in, the scent of snow and pine following him. He set his axe by the wall, brushed the frost from his coat, and smiled faintly when he saw her still awake. "You're not asleep yet." Abigail looked up, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to break the quiet. "I'm afraid if I close my eyes, I'll wake to find the snow has buried the house." Elias chuckled softly, kneeling to warm his hands by the fire. "Out here, snow isn't something to fear. It just wants to see if we've got the patience to wait for spring." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the flames. Then Abigail spoke, her gaze still fixed on the window. "Elias, do you ever think maybe we spend our whole lives searching for where we belong only to never find it?" He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I used to," he said quietly. "But I've learned that sometimes the place we belong isn't a piece of land. It's a person." The flickering light painted his face in shades of amber and shadow. For the first time, Abigail saw not the man hardened by loss, but someone willing to let himself feel again. Her voice trembled. "I don't know who I am in your life, Elias, a guest passing through, or another wound you're trying to heal with kindness." He didn't answer at once. Then, slowly, he reached out, rough, work-worn fingers brushing her cheek with the gentleness of someone afraid to break what's precious. "No, Abigail," he said, his tone low and steady. "You're not a wound. You're the first peace I've known in years." Their eyes met hers full of hesitation, his full of quiet truth. No more words followed, only the sound of two hearts beating in time with each other. Elias leaned closer. The kiss that found them wasn't the kind the town gossips dreamed of. No fever, no haste, just the soft meeting of two people who had both been broken and were learning, carefully, to believe in warmth again. It was gentle as falling snow, fragile as the moment between dusk and dawn. Not born from desire, but from the simple, breathtaking fact of still being alive enough to feel. Abigail closed her eyes. A single tear slipped free not from sorrow, but from the shock of realizing that she could still love, that her heart, long buried under the ashes of Riverbend, could still stir again. When Elias pulled away, he looked at her, really looked, and his eyes were clear as spring water. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She shook her head softly. "There's nothing to be sorry for." Then she smiled the smallest, truest smile he had ever seen. Turning away, she wrapped her arms around herself, trembling from cold, from emotion, from something new she dared not name. "You know," she whispered, voice rough, "I used to think I was only ever someone to be pitied. But you make me feel like I could be loved." Elias said nothing. He simply draped a wool blanket over her shoulders and sat beside her, the quiet between them more intimate than touch. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the windows in a thin white film. Inside, the firelight flickered across the wooden walls, dancing like a silent witness to something fragile, newly born, and too real to name aloud. Abigail turned to him once more. "What are you most afraid of?" "Elias." He thought for a long time before answering. "That I'll wake tomorrow, and all of this will have been just a dream." She smiled faintly. "I'm afraid of that, too." The wind moaned against the cabin. Elias rose, adding another log to the fire. "Get some rest, Abigail," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be long." She stood, moving past him toward her room. Then she stopped, turned back, and spoke, her voice small but steady. "Thank you for not turning away from me when everyone else did." Elias's eyes met hers, warm, sure, steady. "I only did what any decent man should, but if I had to do it again, I'd still choose you." She smiled once more, hand pressed to her chest, feeling the wild rhythm of her own heart alive, unguarded, free. That night, she didn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the look in his, that quiet promise of something neither dared to name. And for the first time in years, peace settled over her, not the peace of safety, but of being seen, known, and accepted. The next morning, the snow had stopped. Sunlight broke weakly over the prairie, turning the frost into a sea of diamonds from the porch. Abigail watched Elias lead his horse along the fence line. He looked back, caught her watching, and lifted a hand in greeting. She smiled and waved back. No words were needed. They both knew something had changed forever between them. But in the West, no winter lasts without thaw, and when the ice begins to melt, the past buried deep and silent starts to rise. From River Bend City, a stranger is coming to Silver Hollow, carrying the old name Abigail once tried to bury, and with him, the love they've just begun to build will face its first true test. Winter was loosening its grip. Snow melted slowly from the eaves of Turner Homestead, revealing patches of yellow grass and the muddy road that wound its way toward Silver Hollow. The air was still cold, but the sunlight had changed softer now, as if it meant to coax the sleeping earth back to life. Inside the small wooden house, Abigail stood by the window, her fingers tracing the rim of a half-empty jar of honey. She thought of that night, the snow, the fire, Elias's voice telling her she was the first peace I've ever known. The memory warmed her, but it also ached, fragile as thin ice over running water. Happiness, she'd learned, was a delicate thing in the West. One wrong wind could shatter it. That afternoon, Elias prepared to ride into town for deliveries. He asked if she wanted to come, but Abigail shook her head gently. "I'll stay and watch the horses," she said, her voice low, calm, but distant. He nodded, slipping on his gloves. "If the wind picks up, stay inside. This time of year, snow still likes to come back for one last fight." The door closed behind him. She stood listening until the sound of hooves faded down the dirt road, an unease blooming quietly in her chest, the kind that arrives without reason, yet never lies. In the Silver Lantern Saloon, laughter and piano filled the air. Elias only meant to stop for a cup of coffee before heading home. But when he walked in, the noise dimmed, eyes turned his way. At a corner table, two men leaned close, whispering, "That's him, isn't it?" the rancher keeping Ruby Blue. The name hit Elias like a stray bullet, sharp, familiar, and full of dread. From the crowd, a man stepped forward. He was thin, unshaven, his coat stained with whiskey and road dust. His smile was the kind that carried poison. "Elias Turner," he drawled. "Didn't think I'd see you out here. I knew your lady back in Riverbend. She went by Ruby Blue then. The whole damn town knew her name." The words cut through the room like a blade. Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "You're drunk. Go home." The man laughed louder. "Drunk? Sure. But I ain't lying. You think you can wash the paint off a saloon girl and make her a lady? Folks like her, they don't change, Turner." Laughter rippled through the saloon, mean and sharp as broken glass. Elias said nothing. He placed a few coins on the counter and walked out, every step heavier than the last, the sound of that name, Ruby Blue, echoing behind him. When he reached home, night had fallen. Abigail was by the fire, stitching a handkerchief, her shoulders small and still beneath the lamplight. He paused in the doorway, watching her, and felt the world outside trying to steal her from him all over again. She looked up, smiling softly. "You're home earlier than I thought." He didn't answer right away. He sat beside her, weariness etched deep in his face. After a long silence, he said quietly, "Someone came from Riverbend today." Her needle slipped. The small metallic sound as it hit the floor was sharper than thunder. "What did he say?" Elias hesitated, then told the truth because lies, he knew, only deepened wounds. "He called you Ruby Blue, said you worked at the Blue Lantern." Abigail closed her eyes. That name, the one she'd buried, rose again, cold and cruel. Ruby Blue. The name of the woman she became when she had no choice, singing through cigarette smoke and whiskey haze, earning coins to buy medicine for her dying brother. The name that had followed her like a curse. "Elias," she whispered, "I never wanted you to know." He reached out, his hand warm against her shoulder. "Your past doesn't change what I feel for you." Her tears came then not from shame, but from the terrible understanding that others would not forgive so easily. They never did. By morning, the story had spread through Silver Hollow like wildfire. The woman living with Elias Turner, once known as Ruby Blue, the singer from the Blue Lantern. When Elias went into town, people averted their gaze. When Abigail fetched water from the well, the children whispered and giggled behind their hands. It was happening again, only this time the cruelty wasn't hers to bear alone. That night, Abigail sat at the table with a single lamp burning low. The room was quiet except for the faint hiss of snow melting outside. She took up a pen. Her handwriting trembled, but her eyes were calm. "Elias, I know you'll tell me not to go, but I can't let your name sink beneath the weight of mine. You've given me more than anyone ever has: respect, trust, and a place where my heart could finally rest. If there's another life after this one, I hope I find you there, if only to say thank you for believing in me when no one else would. Abigail." She folded the letter carefully and left it on the table beside the honey jar he'd once given her. Outside, snow began to fall again, the first flurries of spring, soft as farewell. When morning came, Elias woke to silence. The fire had died. On the table lay the letter, the unfinished handkerchief, and an emptiness that no warmth could fill. He read her words again and again, his hands trembling though his eyes stayed dry. Then he stepped outside. The prairie stretched before him, pale and endless. Tiny footprints led away from the house, fading into the horizon. He knew she hadn't run because she was afraid. She'd left because she loved him, and love, in its truest form, sometimes meant letting go. Spring came. The fields turned green again, but Elias felt only the hollow spaces between things. He kept working, fixing fences, tending the herd, but each evening, when the wind moved through the porch, he could almost hear her singing, the voice of Ruby Blue, soft, sorrowful, beautiful, carried on the wind like a ghost that refused to fade. Then, one afternoon, a rider from Riverbend arrived with grim news. A merchant convoy had been attacked on the road east of town. Among the travelers, there was a woman traveling alone. Elias stood there for a long time, the words sinking deep. Then he turned toward the barn, saddled his horse, and looked once more at the empty house behind him. He knew what he had to do. He was going to find her, and whether she was alive or gone to heaven's quiet plains. Elias Turner would not rest until he saw Abigail Moore Ruby Blue one last time. Narrated in the haunting, cinematic tone of Frontier Hearts, where love defies death and redemption walks hand in hand with the storm. The blizzard came earlier than anyone in Wyoming had expected. Across the endless plains, the wind screamed like a funeral horn, hurling sheets of snow into the air until the earth and sky became one. The world turned silver gray, weightless, endless, and cruel. At Turner Homestead, the last coals in the hearth were dying. On the table still lay Abigail's letter, its ink blurred by tears beside the half-stitched handkerchief she would never finish. Elias Turner stood before it, motionless. The windows rattled. The wind howled against the door as if urging him to move. He knew if he waited until morning, it might be too late. He grabbed his worn leather coat, wrapped a scarf tight around his neck, stuffed a revolver and a few rations into his saddlebag. Then, without another thought, he opened the door and stepped into the storm. Oh, hi! The plains stretched out, wide and merciless. No paths were visible now. The snow had swallowed every trace of direction. The wind slashed at his face, biting into his skin. Even his horse faltered, trembling under the weight of the gale. Elias leaned forward, shielding his eyes and shouting into the void. "Abigail, can you hear me?" The wind stole his voice, shredding it into nothing. Only the sound of the storm answered back, sharp and cold as a knife. He thought of her then, standing by the doorway the day before, her hair glowing like honey in the dying sun. He remembered her words. "If there's a place I belong, it's wherever you are." And in that moment, amid the white fury of the storm, Elias understood he would not let the woman he loved vanish like a dream in the snow. Darkness fell. He rode past broken fences, across the frozen creek, down the old eastern trail where the abandoned rail line once ran. The blizzard thickened, stinging his eyes, numbing his hands. Just when exhaustion began to drag him under, a flicker of light caught his eye faint, trembling, like a candle fighting to stay alive. He spurred his horse toward it. The light came from the old Silver Hollow train depot, long abandoned since the new tracks were built to the south. The wooden door hung crooked, the roof half collapsed, snow heaped thick on the steps. Elias pushed inside. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Then he saw her huddled in a corner, pale, covered in frost. "Abigail, He dropped to his knees, gathering her into his arms. Her skin was so cold he feared he'd already lost her. Her tangled hair clung to her face, her lips bluish, her eyes barely open. He shook her gently, voice breaking. "Don't you dare fall asleep. Abigail, don't you leave me now." After a long, shivering pause, her lashes fluttered, her lips trembled as she whispered, barely audible. "Elias, why are you here?" He held her closer, his voice raw but certain. "Because you never left my heart, not for a single day." He wrapped his coat around her and pulled her against his chest, pressing her to the rhythm of his heartbeat, slow, steady, stubborn against the cold. She opened her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks, whether from pain or relief. He couldn't tell. "You're a fool. Elias Turner," she murmured. "You shouldn't have come. I'm not worth it." He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the chill of her skin. His words came low and rough, but filled with warmth. "Listen to me, Abigail. I don't love you in spite of your past. I love you because of it. The woman who survived it, who still believes in kindness, who still dares to love, that's the woman I fell in love with." Abigail broke, then sobbing quietly into his shoulder. Outside, the snow softened, as if even the storm paused to listen. Elias gathered scraps of wood, built a small fire. The flames flickered weakly, painting their faces in gold and shadow, two weary souls clinging to the same fragile light. "I left," she whispered, "so your name wouldn't be dragged down by mine. I couldn't let my shame become your burden." He shook his head slowly. "Honor isn't something people give us, Abigail. It's how we live, how we love, and I choose to love you, completely, without regret." Her tears glimmered in the firelight, but her eyes were bright now, bright with life, with belief. "Elias," she breathed. He smiled faintly, reaching into his coat pocket. From it, he pulled a small, time-worn box. Inside lay a thin silver ring, dull with age. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "She told me if you ever find someone who makes you want to come home every day, give her this ring." He took her hand, cold, trembling, but still warm enough to hold. "Abigail Moore, will you let me come home to you?" She didn't speak, only nodded, a tiny motion, fragile as breath. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking. Outside, the storm began to quiet. The last flakes drifted down, melting as they touched the roof, turning into the first drops of thaw. Morning came clear and bright, the sky a flawless blue. From the old depot, two riders emerged their horses, cutting slow paths across the snowfields toward the rising sun. Elias glanced back once, at the lonely building that had nearly been their grave. Then he turned to her, squeezing her hand gently. "Let's go home," he said. Abigail leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. And then, softly, she began to sing the same song she'd once sung on a winter night, the one that had carried her pain. But now, the melody was different, lighter, stronger. It rose into the morning air, full of hope, like spring breaking through frost. Yet the frontier is never content to end in peace. When the two of them return to Silver Hollow, they must face a town full of watching eyes, a town that must learn, at last, what it means to forgive, and what it means to love someone not for who they were, but for who they've become. Their story, whispered across the prairies and through the years, would become more than a romance. It would become a testament to the untamed heart of the American West, told in the warm, cinematic tone of frontier hearts, tender, humble, and radiant with redemption. 2 days after the blizzard, the Wyoming sky turned a shade of blue so pure it almost hurt to look at. The last gray clouds drifted toward the horizon, leaving behind a vast, open calm. Sunlight spilled across the prairie where the snow had melted, revealing patches of young green grass, the earth's quiet promise that spring always comes to those patient enough to wait. Out there on the open plain, Turner homestead stood simple, sturdy, still carrying the chill of winter, yet now holding something new peace. Inside Abigail Moore's heart, something had shifted forever. The loneliness that once clung to her like a shadow was gone. She no longer felt like a stranger in the world. She belonged here to this land, to this quiet home, and to the man who had walked through a storm to bring her back. That morning, Elias rose early. He wandered down by the thawing creek, where shards of ice floated past like broken glass, and gathered a few wildflowers pushing through the wet soil. They were small, fragile, violet blossoms growing between stones, but to him they were perfect. They reminded him of her, soft but strong enough to bloom in the coldest places. When he returned, Abigail was hanging quilts out on the porch. The sun lit her hair, turning it to gold. Elias stopped for a long while, simply watching, afraid that if he blinked, the moment might slip away. "I used to think," he said quietly, "that a man like me didn't deserve peace. But now, looking at you standing there, I know I was wrong. You make everything right." Abigail turned, smiling faintly. "If you keep talking like that, I'll never get these quilts dry before sunset." He laughed, a rare sound, deep and warm, as if it came from a place long closed off. Then, reaching into his coat, he pulled out something small, the silver ring, polished, glinting in the sunlight. "Abigail," he said, his voice low but steady, "I don't have a grand church or a fine crowd of guests, but I have a roof, a bit of land, and a heart all yours, if you'll have them." She froze, eyes glistening. "Elias," he stepped closer, took her hands, those hands that had known both labor and trembling, and were now warm in his. "Will you be my wife?" A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of earth and new grass. Abigail looked at him, this man with quiet strength, a gentle voice, and hands that healed instead of hurt. Then she nodded. No tears, no gasps, no crowd, just silence rich and full, the kind that spoke louder than words. The wedding took place that very afternoon, out in the open fields. No minister, no music, just Elias Turner and Abigail Moore, standing beneath a boundless sky. She wore the same dress she'd arrived in, the faded blue one, edges worn and threads frayed. Elias had told her, "I like it. It carries your story." She didn't paint her face or pin up her hair, only tucked a small wildflower, one of his morning finds, above her ear. The petals trembled in the wind, soft but unbroken, just like her. Elias wore a white shirt, old, but pressed with care. They stood facing each other, the distance of a single step between them. Then he spoke, his voice shaking slightly, as if in prayer. "Before God, before this sky, and before this land, I vow to love you for as long as I have breath." Her answer came like wind through grass, "And I vow to stay by your side not out of gratitude, but because my heart chose you before I even knew what love was." He slipped the ring onto her finger. The old silver glimmered softly in the golden light. No witnesses stood by, only birds singing from the fence posts, and the whisper of the prairie wind. But for them, It was enough, because love doesn't need a crowd. It only needs two hearts that know where they belong. Elias leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a quiet, reverent kiss that held gratitude, promise, and the first breath of a new beginning. Abigail rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes as the wind carried away all that had come before the laughter of those who'd mocked her. The lonely nights, the years she'd spent believing she was unworthy of love. She was no longer Ruby Blue. She was Abigail Turner, the wife of a man who loved her not out of pity, but because she had always been worthy of it. That evening, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the prairie drown in the pink glow of sunset. Elias poured 2 glasses of corn whiskey. "I suppose we should call this a wedding feast," he said with a grin. "Even if there's only the 2 of us, it's reason enough to raise a glass. Don't you think?" Abigail laughed softly. "You have a way of making everything feel like enough." They clinked their glasses. The whiskey burned at first sharp, honest, but the sweetness lingered long after, warming their throats. It tasted, they both thought, a lot like life itself, bitter in the beginning, sweet in the end, made bearable only by faith and kindness. In the months that followed, life at Turner Homestead passed in gentle rhythm. But their story didn't end with a wedding, because on the frontier, love isn't just a happy ending. It's the hard, sacred work of living, forgiving, and choosing each other again and again. And over time, the tale of Elias and Abigail Turner, the rancher and the woman once called Ruby Blue, became more than a love story. It became a lesson whispered across the wide Wyoming plains, that compassion can outlast judgment, that forgiveness is the bravest kind of strength, and that even in the harshest lands, love, simple, steadfast love, can still take root and bloom. Years had passed since that fateful winter storm. Spring, summer, and winter came and went over the fields of Turner Homestead. Yet one thing never changed every sunset. A thin wisp of smoke still rose from the old wooden house, and drifting through the wind came the soft, steady voice of Abigail Turner, gentle, serene, like the wind brushing through prairie grass. Her voice had changed over the years. It no longer trembled with fear, no longer carried the weight of sorrow. It was free now, warm, clear, and pure as water from a mountain spring. People in the town of Silver Hollow often paused in their work just to listen to catch a moment of peace amid their restless lives. They used to say, "Her voice makes the grass greener and the sunsets softer." But Elias knew the truth. It wasn't her voice that changed the world. It was her. Time had left its marks on them both. Silver streaked through his hair, and faint lines traced her face like the delicate etchings of the wind. Yet their eyes, those eyes, still held the same calm, grateful light they had from the beginning. They never had children, and neither of them grieved for it. Once, Abigail said, "Perhaps God knew our love was already enough to fill this small world, so he chose not to give us any burden beyond that." Elias smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't need anything more than you," and she answered softly. "And you are enough for me to believe that life, even late in the day, can still begin again." The years at Turner Homestead passed like a quiet song with no words. Every morning, Elias rose early to tend the fields and horses. Abigail brewed tea, baked bread, and set breakfast on the old wooden table. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was warm, easy, and full of understanding. They lived simply, but never in isolation. The people of Silver Hollow, those who once turned their backs on them, slowly changed. Maybe it was Elias's quiet decency. Maybe it was the way Abigail's gentle singing drifted out whenever someone came by asking for water or shelter from the rain. At first, people were shy about coming near, but one day, Mrs. Harriet Collingwood, the grocer's wife, visited. "I hear you sing beautifully, Mrs. Turner. Why don't you sing at church this Sunday?" Abigail smiled but said nothing. Yet the following Sunday, she came. She stood before the congregation, no choir, no organ, and sang Amazing Grace. Not like a hymn, not like a performance, but like a confession from someone who had once been lost and finally found her way home. When her song ended, no one spoke. Many bowed their heads, a few wept quietly. From that day on, the name Ruby Blue vanished from memory. Only Abigail Turner remained the woman who reminded the town that forgiveness isn't forgetting the past. It's learning to see it in a different light. 10 years later, Elias no longer rode much. His knees had grown weak and his eyesight dim. But every evening, he still sat on the porch, listening as Abigail sang by the creek. She'd bring a small chair and sit beneath the willow tree, where the reeds swayed gently in the wind. And when her song rose into the twilight, Elias would close his eyes. He didn't need to look, just listening was enough to know that his life was complete. One autumn evening, as the wind slipped softly through the cracks of their door, Abigail reached out and touched his hand. "Elias," she whispered, "have you ever wondered what would have happened if you hadn't found me in that snowstorm?" He tightened his grip, smiling faintly. "I would have kept searching until I did, because without you, I'd have no reason to ever come home." She laughed, voice as light as the breeze. "Then I suppose I've owed you a home all my life?" He answered quietly, "No, Abigail, you are my home." The following spring, Elias Turner passed away in his sleep just as dawn broke. They found him sitting in his chair on the porch, a faint smile on his lips, and in his hand, the embroidered handkerchief bearing her name. The whole town came to his funeral not out of pity, but out of respect. Abigail did not cry before them, but when everyone had gone, she sat beside his grave, placed a single wildflower on the stone, and whispered, "Mr. Turner, I'll keep singing, so you'll know I'm still here and that I never stopped being grateful." Years passed, and Silver Hollow changed. A new railroad line came through, merchants arrived, houses rose close together, and the old frontier slowly gave way to modern life. But in the memories of the townsfolk amid all that noise and progress, there was always the image of an old woman with silver hair, sitting by the field, singing into the sunset. Children would ask, "Who is that lady?" And the elders would smile and say, "That's Mrs. Turner, the woman who taught Silver Hollow what true love means." Their story became legend, told in cafes, whispered by firesides on long winter nights, a testament that love can rise again from judgment and kindness can bloom even from hearts once broken. They say that if one evening you find yourself standing on the Wyoming prairie and the wind carries a faint, distant melody, close your eyes, because maybe, just maybe, it's the voice of Abigail Turner, the woman who sang her whole life to remind the world of one simple truth. No matter how cruel life can be, there will always be a place to come home to, a place built on love, on kindness, and on faith in the goodness of the human heart. The story of Abigail Turner and Elias Turner, a mail-order bride rejected for her past as a saloon girl, until a lonely rich cowboy gave her a future is more than a love tale set on the harsh American frontier. It's a gentle reminder of the enduring power of kindness and forgiveness. Amid prejudice, loss, and loneliness, these two souls chose to live with grace to see each other with compassion instead of judgment. That courage transformed their painful past into the light of a new beginning. And maybe, in today's world, we all carry old wounds, things that make us doubt our own worth. But their story reminds us that a person's true value isn't defined by where they once fell, but by how they rise and how they choose to love again. Because love, after all, doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be sincere, forgiving, and brave enough to believe that goodness still has a place in this world. If the story of Elias and Abigail touched your heart, take a moment to leave a like, share this video to spread its warmth to others, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts to hear more stories of healing where love and kindness still bloom amid the dust and wind of the American West. Thank you for listening and for still believing in the goodness within us all.